Okay, we are live. Um, so here's part two. We're going to talk more exclusively about Otto von Habsburg um, and the Mont Pelerin Society. The thumbnail, I don't know if it actually lined correctly, but the thumbnail is the two founders of the Mont Pelerin Society, the philosophical founders. One is Karl Popper, who is one of the fathers of modern liberalism, postmodern liberalism, post Holocaust liberalism, whatever you want to call it. He was one of the chief figures of the uh, CIA's, um, which I've actually told people this and they didn't believe it. The CIA ran the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is what created and promoted people like Adorno and all sorts of crazy people. We'll do a show on that too. And it's not cultural Marxism; it's cultural Fabianism. Cultural Marxism. If you look at the Frankfurt School, they made up this term. They reused Marx and put a bunch of words in Marx's mouth that Marx never said. And they did the same thing with Freud. Freud's social psychology was actually very pro family, which is why a lot of the neuroses that Freud dealt with mother and father issues. And it wasn't the issue that the mother and father were the issue, it was issues regarding not being part of a wholesome family. So on both counts, they bastardized Marx, they bastardized Freud, and sold you this is some sort of Marxist issue, which is why everybody believes part of the reason why everybody believes it was the KGB that created all these things and cultural Marxism that created all these things, rather than what it really is, which is Fabianism, which is run out of Oxford. And so Karl Popper was this kind of leading Fabian, and or Fabian type individual. Congress of Cultural Freedom was this thing that promoted the Frankfurt School and people like Adorno, Horkheimer, tons of other people, Bertrand Russell. But it was run by a literal, self-professed CIA agent named Michael Josselson, and the CIA admits to this. It's on their website, so have a fun time looking at that if you're a skeptic. But then on the other hand, you have von Mises. Um, is it von Mises or is it von Hayek? I always get the two confused. Regardless, he started out as a Fabian socialist and created the modern concept of libertarianism. Yeah, von Hayek created the modern concept of libertarianism simply on the basis of some minor disputes with Fabian socialism. So, I think that's a nice introduction to understanding now the power players and the actual intelligence and aristocratic apparatus behind the system. If we already see that it's extremely flawed in its outset, despite the fact that it informs all these other libertarian institutions, um, and particularly starting with the Reagan White House, but somehow it's controlled by these Fabian socialists and old time aristocrats. How does that it doesn't seem like anything good for the United States or any nation state could come out of that. So we're going to talk about Otto von Habsburg and how he's implemented some of these ideas of the Mont Pelerin Society into um, the European Union, even, and what future plans might be for the European Union based on this old magazine here. So this is from old Executive Intelligence Review article. It's the first of, I think, a three-part series, and it's March 20th, 1979. So we're going to read a window first that's on here. It says, our special report this week begins the serialization of a lengthy expose of Otto von Habsburg in the Pan-European Union that will soon be released in a pamphlet form by the European Labour Party in West Germany. The pamphlet are the gods of the and activities of Otto von Habsburg, goals and activities of Otto von Habsburg, and his Pan-European Union Unconstitutional, was prepared as a report to the Special Party Convention on European Parliamentary Elections of the European Labour Party held in Bonn on January 28th. The European Labour Party report was translated from German by James Cleary from our Europe desk. Quotations from Count Richard Coldenherv Kalergi are taken from the extensive number of books and articles published between 1925 and 1970, in which the Pan European Union was made available through Europe, particularly through its journal Pan Europe. Okay, Archduke Otto von Hapsburg of Lorraine, the leader of the Pan European Union. Now, I will tell everybody this man is now dead, but his progeny still lives on, partly in the Taxis family, etc. Wants to use this year's European Parliament elections to launch an all out attack on the European monetary system. Its co founders, Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and French President Giscard d'Estaing, and its intellectual author, U.S. Labor Party Chairman Lyndon H. LaRouche Jr. In a recent interview, Hapsburg applauded the Chinese as National Socialists, eminently useful in containing the Soviet Union, railed against the détente as the quickest, most dangerous transfer of technology to the Soviet Union, enabling the Russians thereby to strengthen their efforts to destroy the West, and appealed to East Europe, particularly Hungary and Romania, the only nations in the East Bloc whose people are not Slavs, to cut away from the Russian sphere of influence altogether. In fact, Habsburg's view of a Europe of regions includes pulling Romania and Hungary away from the East Bloc and into the reconstituted Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled by the would-be heir of the Habsburg throne. This report uncovers Otto von Habsburg, his international oligarchical network, and his long-term commitment to the unification of Europe through the feudalization of Europe, a commitment shared by his family's influential Order of the Golden Fleece. Subtitle: An Open Conspiracy. As early as 1954, Count Richard Coldenherv Kalergi, the founder and leader of the Pan-European Union, until 1973, described the organization's character in the post-war period. The Pan-European Union should become the unofficial representative of the multilingual European nation, going beyond all nations and languages and parties, and without any kind of communist infiltration. This will force the PEU to become a solid international group. A political club, a kind of open conspiracy, as H.G. Wells described in one of his books. There's another Fabian connection. It is no accident that Count Coldenherv Kalergi cited H.G. Wells. Wells, the British science fiction writer and Secret Service agent, was the Coldenherv Kalergi's most important intellectual father, among the inner elite of oligarchs that set up Count Coldenherv Kalergi as they did Adolf Hitler, to function as their instrument against the industrial and East-West cooperation politics of the Rapallo forces of the 1920s. At the beginning of this century, H.G. Wells has developed the New Dark Ages scenario for securing the British oligarchy's world rule. After a great catastrophe such as Great War, a small elite established as the priests of science will rule the decimated masses of their subjects from their country seats through the use of feudal methods, the application of magic, the occult, drugs, and synthetic cult worship. It was the scenario for the New Dark Ages that Count Coldenherv Kalergi had in mind when he began setting up the Pan-European Union in the 1920s and 1930s with the support of the banking houses of Rothschild and Warburg. He combined elements of Anglophile Nazism like Hjalmar Schacht's concept of corporatism and the concentration camp, and Karl Haushofer's geopolitical concept of the encirclement of the Soviet Union with H.G. Wells' cult teaching to set up a fascist movement, the European-style Blue Shirts Party, which paralleled Hitler and Mussolini's organization. Its symbol was a red cross impressed on the sun disk of Apollo. Otto von Habsburg's Pan-European Union follows the same tradition. Its statement of principles in 1973, when Habsburg took over the leadership of the organization, states: the Pan-European Union, which is meeting for the first time since the death of founder President Coldenherv Kalergi, announces its unbreakable fidelity to his ideas and ideals. It also promises to continue to work in his spirit. The PEU, an anti-industrial and anti-capitalist shock troop, wants to use the European Parliament elections to implement Britain's medieval model throughout all of Europe. It is a flank in Britain's global destabilization deployments, which includes the fight over the U.S. presidency and Iran-modeled religious rebellions, primarily along the southern border of the Soviet Union. In order to be able to realize these ideas, the PEU also needs representatives of its ideas in its future European Parliament. Two PEU vice presidents already belong to the European Parliament. The task of the PEU must be to exert influence on these political parties that are closest to it in order to send even more representatives to the presently forming European Parliament. Negotiations with those who have responsibility in these parties are already underway. Wherever PEU candidates are nominated, the organization will also take part in the election and will work for these candidates with the goal of getting as many PEU candidates as possible on the party list. The PEU does not consider the formation of its own party to be of service towards its goals. Emphasis here because if you notice all of these extreme right wing and left wing parties emerging in Europe, they all have very similar economic programs, which is not good for the economies. Backwards economic programs. And they're all very focused on getting people riled up, but not much more than that. So let me read that again. This is exact quotes from this organization for the Pan European Union. The Pan European Union does not consider the formation of its own party to be of service towards its goals, and believes in getting its candidates to the goal through the path provided by the existing parties. Given the fact that Otto von Hapsburg has obtained a leading place in the Bavarian Christian Social Union Party list, according to CSU Chairman Franz Joseph Strauss, who considers Hapsburg a desirable element, then it is particularly urgent to put an end to the open conspiracy before the plans for a feudalized Europe for England became a reality. I'll be right back. Let's get a little more. The French model of a Europe of the fatherland is composed of sovereign and centrally organized nation states along the lines proposed by Charles de Gaulle. It is oriented towards economic and industrial progress, turning Europe into a supplier of advanced technology to the entire world. This model is the basis of the European Labour Party's program, the Entente of the Sovereign European Republics. Habsburg's Pan Europa, on the other hand, will be divided into national minorities and separate regions. It will be divested of its industry and used as a Britain's battering ram against the states of the Warsaw Pact. According to Strauss, this Europe will overcome narrow categories of thought limited to the nation state and will allow the forces of political structure that has matured to become fruitful for the coalescence of the community. Today, the ethnic groups of the Working Group of Alpine Countries, ARG Alp, the future Alpine fortress of Europe's oligarchical forces, already serves as a model for the political structure that has matured. With the establishment of the Org Alp, a milestone in the unification of Europe has occurred that has the character of a model, so the urgent cry for the unification of all European countries will go out from Tyrol and Innsbruck. We demand of the governments that they follow the will of the great majority of European peoples and that they undertake everything to correspond to this will and to further formations of regions that go beyond the national boundaries. They give these regions seats and voices in the European Parliament. Naturally, these self administered regions will have no powers concerning other states. The regions will concern themselves with all petty and smallest details of the kitchen that is now always becoming smaller. One can well imagine how, according to the Habsburgs, the politically closed off race of Vorarlbergers will look out for the race of the Ostrophicenes and vice versa. The classical British self government concept with which the British have a long experience as a colonial power, will destroy the sovereign nation states of Europe. The decisive geopolitical establishment of Europe as a front directed against the Soviet Union will be controlled by the traditionally supranational oriented imperial rule of the Habsburgs. Otto von Habsburg's goal is to set himself up before the European Parliament as a monarch who determines Europe's defense, foreign, economic, finance, research, energy, and environmental policy. In practical form, this would be the realization of Wells' utopia of a small elite of priests of science who would keep the masses of their subjects in perpetual feudal existence. The goal of Pan Europa is the annexation of the East European countries because these people were battered away to hegemony at Yalta in 1945. Even in the atomic age, this is a quote, our security can be guaranteed by having the Carpathian Basin and Balkans free of foreign influence. And above all this, the program does not exclude the West coming together, so long as the liberation of the East is not a fact. It is only that the thought that must follow the smaller solution is that it is not all of Europe, but only the seed kernel of its future greatness. The annexation is to be carried out through increasing subversion of the East European countries following the model of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. It would be part of global destabilization in which Otto von Habsburg wants to employ his old Eastern division of the Maltese Order, his leftist dissidents, and the ethnic minorities in the former imperial territory. Just a short time ago, Habsburg repeated his conviction that Romania and Hungary are the best possible possibilities for subversion. He says the integration of the earth should make Western Europe the center of attraction for those areas it touches, as soon as a change in the long term weather solution, which will be announced by events in the Far East, gives the Middle European people the possibility of winning back their independence and of exercising the right of self determination. Subheading Hofschofer, Habsburg, and Hitler. The Anglo Bavarian agent and geopolitician of the Wittelsbach royal family of Bavaria, Major General Karl Hofschofer, was responsible both for the training of Adolf Hitler in the inner Nazi circle and for writing most of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And this is an editorial here, it's not included, but Hofschofer got his ideas from Halford Mackinder, who was one of the main roundtable group members of the British establishment and actually coined geopolitics. All of the Nazis' basic ideas show their origin in the teachings of Karl Hofschofer: geopolitical expansion to the east, an economic outlook of hostility towards industry, and the application of the Darwinian theory of survival of the fittest. Once again, the Darwinians are the primitive version of the Fabian socialist, because you have the Huxley family there, which they support some sort of eugenic program in Fabian socialism, directly derivative of Darwin. And it wasn't Charles Darwin that was the social Darwinian, but one of his relatives who coined social Darwinism, and that came together with the Huxley crowd and their influence on Fabian socialism. Going on. Major General Hofschofer not only had close relations with Hitler and the leading Nazis, but was also close to Count Goldenherr Kalergi, who wrote, in 1933, General Hofschofer from Munich visited us. We have known him for years. He always found friendly words for Pan-Europa in his Zeitschrift für Geopolitik, for he is sympathetic towards it because it is a major territorial idea. During the evening of foundation of the Munich Pan-European Group, he and Thomas Mann is a Venetian and friend of the Fabian Society. If I remember correctly, Thomas Mann is the writer. But anyway, going on. We're the table neighbors of my wife, but in spite of major territorial policy, he was a Bavarian monarchist. He faced the Third Reich with great skepticism. He depicted Hitler, whom he personally knew, as the typically half-educated person, but in contrast to this, he spoke very warmly about Rudolf Hess. He related how after the Hitler Putsch of 1923, Hess fled to him, and he hid him from the police for a week in his villa. If Hess is really such a nice person, I said, how could he then become a Nazi? Hofschofer was not taken aback, for he answered, he then met that Hitler and became a Nazi. If he had met you, he would have become a pan-European. Otto von Habsburg has a deep admiration for the teachings of Adolf Hitler and Rudolf Hess. At an election rally in Munich during the summer of 1978, Habsburg complained that he unfortunately had never had the chance to study directly under Karl Hofschofer. Nevertheless, he knew this geopolitical studies very well, which is otherwise a notable component of the unbreakable fidelity to Count Goldenherr Kalergi's ideas and the ideals. Shortly afterward, Otto von Habsburg confirmed this connection. A study of history using this perspective teaches us that the technology changes, be they ever so penetrating, only change the laws of geopolitics very little. Of course, there are new dimensions, but the essential remains the same. The experiment of the past teaches us anyway that the laws of geopolitics are only an offer. The decision to use them or to misconstrue them belongs to man. In correspondence with the laws of geopolitics, Bavaria, a geopolitically important area for hundreds of years, is once again to fulfill a historic task. Together with the lands of the Alpine fortress, Bavaria serves as the launching point for the subversion of the sovereign republics of Europe, East and West. Quote, once again, as in the time of change in the present millennium, Bavaria became the eastern march of Europe united in itself. This development demands the Bavaria once again think and act in a worldwide sense. The new situation is a challenge to the policy of Bavaria. The first duty against such a hostile thrust forward is to bring the attack to a standstill, to hold one's position. One can say that Bavaria has fulfilled this task. In order to hold firmly to one's own soil, the decision has been made to defend the rights of those who have fallen under the hegemony of the powers outside of Europe. Here, too, Bavaria, as Europe's eastern march, has played an essential role. Why? It was just recently that the Bavarians stored the future. This policy by Bavaria earns the thanks of a truly free Europe. The fact that in the meantime Franz Joseph Strauss has become the minister president of the Free State of Bavaria guarantees that Otto von Habsburg's geopolitics will soon be understood in an effective sense. Strauss said in his first government declaration, Bavaria stands in the focus point of the intellectual, cultural, and political currents of Europe. Otto von Habsburg outlined the role in Munich and Bavaria are to play in his pan-Europea. Quote, in the post-war period, Munich will be described as the secret capital of Middle Europe. He who notices today how strongly Munich affects the Danubian basin in Bohemia will ascribe to this statement. It is not too imprecise to say that numerous immigrants who come from the non-German peoples exert themselves to set up their residence in Munich in order to preserve those kinds of ties into their homeland. Bavaria and its capital city of Munich are called on today more than ever before to carry out the large-scale politics. It has a parallel task to that which Vienna has fueled in the course of history. A lot of items in the future of Europe depend on Bavaria's fulfilling its historical sense of duty. Bavaria's responsibility in and for Europe is essentially greater than at any time since the end of the 14th century. Subtitle Pan Europa Economic Autarky. The organization of the economy will be comparable to the feudalistically backward but autarchical principles of the late Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Hapsburg would dismantle the unintelligible monopolies in the favor of many small independent existences. Instead of capitalism or communism, the Pan European Union advocates the third way of feudalistic oligarchical life on the land. The PEU states in the Declaration of Basic Principles of 1973, quote, in the same manner, the PEU stands out for maintaining the independent and family operated concerns. It is convinced that Europe needs a strong peasant class, and keeping such a class firmly rooted in the soil and materially assured is an essential precondition for maintaining the balance of power in society. It will oppose with all the means at its disposal those who want to sacrifice the existence of our agriculture on the altar of alleged economic rationality or the false understanding of the challenges of international trade. The PEU is not concerned with the very necessity increased in the capital intensive productivity of agriculture, but with the manipulation of those true to their homeland, the population clinging to the soil of their own little piece of land to favor its own geopolitical ideas. Hapsburg says, if the development continue to go this way, Europe will find itself in the not too distant future in the position that we find the USA in today. Only about 10% of its total population can still live on the land. In addition to this, one cannot forget in this overseas example that there was never a peasant class as we know it in the United States. The main form of economic activity was the large scale operation, and even the small scale owner was not bound to the soil. True to the concept of the priest of science, according to H.G. Wells, Hapsburg does not totally reject advanced technology. He advocates technology for the armament sector, but he stands with a good, sensible, but somewhat romantic environmentalists. And this is the tie of this whole system to the eco-fascists. And if you notice how many conservatives look towards Theodore Roosevelt as some sort of example of what a man is, of what a conservative is, etc., when Roosevelt closed probably 70% of the land out west to never be used. This is just an example of something like this. Pre-Fabian, but very influenced by Theosophists, I believe. Theodore Roosevelt was. But today, on 4chan, on Poll, you now have all these people talking about the green pill or whatever the hell it is. They're reading the manifestos of, what is it, Ted Kaczynski? And promoting eco-fascism. So this is another ideology that fits into that Venn diagram between the distributionist trad Catholics and the Fabian socialists and the eco fascists. It's all promoted by the same general group of people, Malthusians uh, and Fabians. Nuclear. Okay, so he stands with the romantic environmentalists against the industrial application of nuclear energy. Nuclear technology and advanced technology, he says, are very dangerous, really very dangerous. The masses would never understand advanced technology as such, because the masses only remain controllable through the mystification of technology. Hapsburg wants to make certain, as the monarch of Europe, that this kind of technology is only accessible to the elite. Habsburg's third way coincides with what the propagandists of post industrial society are saying. Quote, both systems, capitalism and communism, are expression of the demon of production. In both of them, the expansion of production stands in the center of the picture of economics. It cannot be denied that an infinite number of possibilities lie in the philosophy of a classless state, particularly in the perspective of the future. A properly planned decentralization of the industry in peasant areas can create extra income for the peasants there, which will make the living standard of the countryside fully equal to that of the city, while those who live in the countryside will once again enjoy the advantage of their own soil and of a healthy environment. Shortening the number of hours worked will, by that way, make this essentially easier. So go get your UBI, your Universal Basic Income, which comes from Mont Pellerin's Milton Friedman. What is very interesting is the direct comparison of this quote to Mein Kampf. Quote, winning new land and soil on which to settle the surplus number of people has infinitely many advantages, especially when one does not have the present but the future in view. Naturally, the possibility of maintaining a healthy peasant class as the fundamental basis of the entire nation can never be valued highly enough. Much of our present day suffering is only the unhealthy consequence of the relation between the agricultural and urban populations. A firm stock of small and medium sized peasants was always at all times the best protection against social sickness, such as those that we possess today. Another warning by Karl Haushofer must have particularly enlightened Otto von Habsburg, namely, the urbanization, a precondition of industrialization, must be undone because to the extent that a nation loses its agricultural character and urbanizes itself, it loses its control of territory and is therefore a weak nation. Count Goldenhof Kalergi's philosophy exerted just as strong of an influence on Otto von Habsburg as the teachings of geopolitician Karl Haushofer. Writes the Count Goldenhof Kalergi. Our civilization is a culture composed of major cities, and therefore it is a swamp plant, born by degenerate, sickly, and decadent people who voluntarily or involuntarily have fallen into this dead end of life. Count Goldenherv Kalergi's philosophy of hyperethics of applied aesthetics proposes that rigorous methods be undertaken to overcome this dead-end civilization. The problem which causes him such nightmares were solved later in programs for the final solution carried out by the Nazis' racial hygienicists, who were also schooled by the British. The only difference between the two is that instead of the word racial hygienics, Goldenherv used the British word eugenics. In parallel to Julian Huxley and L.S. Amory, the British colonial minister, he developed eugenic principles of selection that Hjalmar Schacht would later apply to the concentration camps. Quote, the science of eugenics, which should lead to the realization of practical biology, belongs to the future. It will soon be associated with Nietzsche's world outlook and through it gain the striking power of religion. Eugenics teaches the higher breedings of human beings the exclusion of the less desirable from further reproduction, the new selective breeding. Because most people represent material of less value, he suggests that as in animal breeding, only the most perfect examples of humanity should form the future race. He describes in detail those criteria according to which the value of human being will be determined in a future society. Quote, breeding will play the decisive role, for even the greatest and best reforms on the individual level will be of little use when the material is poor, decayed, and of little value. What results from the impartial observation of modern European and American people is that what is involved here is the very considerably degenerated successors of a very beautiful and noble race. But only the physical perfection of its rare and notable examples speaks for the great possibilities of this race. The large, blond, well proportioned man with a hairless breast, white skin, oval face, and blue eyes, high forehead, narrow loins, noble hands, and feet, thoroughly intellectual features, doubtlessly belongs to one of the greatest creations of nature. the product of an ancient culture in long term breeding. And because this appearance of human being is expression of its inner essence, just like the appearance of an animal or plant, the exterior decay of the average European points to his inner degeneration. Now, granted, this is the same Goldenberg Kalergi that promoted the creation of a, um, whatever he said, a European Negroid race that makes up the peasantry. So they use both eugenics and dysgenics depending on what class you're in. According to Goldenberg, the only country that really understood the principle was England. He says England is an oligarchy of breeding. And even today, the inheritors of this great example of human breeding are in the frontmost ranks of its statesmen. England, which stands at the peak of the horse and dog breeding, recognizes the important value of heredity and use the inherited value of its aristocratic caste to the advantage of the entire nation. This natural aesthetic consists of rejection of all artificial systems of morals, such as Catholicism, which Goldenherve predicts will die out. So, um, why is the guy that wants to rule the Holy Roman Empire and his heirs supporting people like Goldenherve Kalergi who hate Catholicism? And we will find that out, I think, if we go on with secrets not only to the inner elite, that people use um, the dialectic cults, Apollonian and Dionysian cults, to control society. Rather than the actual truth of Catholicism, people get strung up in the politics and the fields. They don't really believe in morality, and that's kind of the basis of neoconservatism too. The real protector of whatever you want to protect in neoconservatism is war, endless war. That's why it derived from Trotskyism through Bill Kristol and friends. Aesthetic laws alone will be decisive, says uh, Kalergi. The will towards the beautiful rules man from the awakening of self consciousness to his last breath. It controls him most strongly during his breeding period. Only aesthetic laws hold in selective breeding, not ethical ones. Nature wants to breed the strongest and most beautiful individuals. It wants to allow those of lesser value to die out and become extinct. So nature at breeding time becomes a contest of strength and beauty. The victor is allowed to procreate and conquer death through form. Because mankind's reason is not creative enough and only fantasy and intuition is really human, Goldenherve suggests that the Europe of the future return to an Apollonian sun cult, represented in the symbol of the Pan European Union. He says Nordic man's return to nature in the sun cult is the return of its oldest traditions. There is nothing foreign or artificial about these myths. They do not contradict the scientific outlook on the world, and yet they stray in harmony with one of the most primitive instincts, with our idealistic and heroic ethics. So this is a hello to 4chan and well, there's morons out there that are promoting Varg tier solutions to the world. Who is promoting your ideology? Going on, this philosophy can be counted on as finding spirited agreement among the oligarchical circles, the environmentalists, and among all anti-industrial Maoists, and so forth. For the realization of the ideology requires not only the rigorous application of Darwinian principles, but also the Rousseauian principles of back to nature. And I think this is Rousseau. If the Occident is to be cured, then everything must be done to replace the flight from the land with the flight from the cities. This is possible by the advancement and intensification of agriculture, by land reform, by the colonization of countries lacking people, by the furtherance of agricultural tradition, and by the creation of an intellectual current that will lead people back to the soil. The main goal, then, as it is today, is to rule out the danger of rational industrial and technological progress embodied in the American and Soviet systems. The victory of Americanism over the European soul means Europe's conscious rejection of traditions, the replacement of humanist education by technical training, and the replacement of the culture of quality by a culture of quantity, the replacement of the form by number. It means the rejection of romanticism and of all beauty for which Europe has to thank the irrationalism of the soul. To be continued. So there's a part two. Let's see what how much time we took. Yeah, I don't really know how many people actually watch this, um, but they better. People like Jay Dyer do somewhat of a good job on geopolitics, but they lack in actual Western history, which is why he doesn't understand he doesn't understand things like the Fourth Crusade. He doesn't understand that the schism with the Orthodox Church fundamentally was political. That there have been the old Roman elite that moved to Venice and other places, attempting to destroy Christendom from the start, and only use Christendom as um, essentially a cult to control people, but also to maintain the balance of power and to maintain their hegemony. So we're going to go with who is Otto von Hapsburg. Um, part two, if I can find it here. I know it's here. I know it's here. One of the things is you can either spell Habsburg with a B or a P, depending on what country you're from. And Google doesn't like that. I think this is it. So this is part two, written in 1979, March 27th. Who is Otto von Habsburg? Part two of an European Labour Party expose of who's behind the Pan European Union. So, subheading. Let's see how many pages this is. I can make it. Keep it under an hour, hopefully. Subheading: The extra parliamentary opposition. As a result of spreading anti industrial propaganda, the Pan European Party today is not the only finding support among oligarchical and other circles commonly described as extreme right, but also among anarchist and Maoist groupings, as well as among the environmentalists. In May 1798, the same month that Helmut Schmidt and Leonid Brezhnev signed the 25-year agreement for peaceful cooperation between the Federal Republic of Germany and the Soviet Union, a conference on the Imperial Russian threat took place in Libsyn, the culmination of a series of preparatory conferences. At the Libsyn Conference, representatives of Maoist organizations joined hands with Pan European Union representatives and with members of Christian Democratic Union and the Federal Republic. Together, they militantly demanded the unification of Western European countries in order to meet the threat of Russian imperialism. The Maoist Communist Party of Germany and the Marxist-Leninist of Germany were present alongside all these supposedly Christian people, um, as well as various representatives of uh, Kaiui von Hassel Hermann Eller's Foundation. Von Hassel is a longtime senior statesman of the CDU. Present, in addition, were Senator Massimo Di Carolis, Italian representative of the Pan European Union, and leader of the group of 100 Christian Democrats who are continually threatening to collapse the Italian Conservative Party of Britain. Or, I skipped the line. Italian government. Representatives of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party of Britain, journalists from Axel Springer's Die Welt newspaper, and Cornelia Gerstenmaier, whose father Eugen is not merely well known for his zealous visits to Otto von Habsburg's. So here's the call: a new militant European youth movement into existence, which will be strongly differentiated from the pan-European movement of today and yesterday, and whose basic character will be revolutionary. Its goal will not only be to unite Europe, but to renew it. It will be a movement that fights on the fronts against the reactionary plutocracy, against totalitarianism, against communism, and against nationalism. The goal of this European national movement must be more radical than that of the Pan-European Union, which is forced to work together with the existing governments for the unification of Europe. The student riots of 1968 collapsed because the goal they set out for themselves was a negative one directed against the existing establishment without a positive program. Habsburg's double strategy consists in the short term of dominating European parliament through the pan-European members that it has insinuated or through the newly won pan-European members who are in existing parties. In the medium term, it is strategy for mobilizing a popular movement. Habsburg's predecessor and teacher, Count Goldenherr Kalergi, described the idea behind the strategy. Revolutions who have generally crystallized around a leadership figure. They can react very quickly when they recognize ideas that are floating about in the air, which is when thousands give form to hopes of and dreams of millions. The example of Lenin and Mussolini show how small groups can powerfully mobilize millions for their ideas. The potential for these revolutionary movement is already at hand in all parts of Europe. It will come to an explosion as soon as it finds the correct leadership. This revolutionary movement is nothing less than a new version of the Blue Shirts Party that Count Goldenherr Kalergi founded in imitation of Hitler's brown shirts. The Kolonische Zeitung of August 8, 1932, wrote the following about the Pan European Union Congress in Basel. Quote, the new party presented itself in Basel and wearing their uniforms too that they created in imitation of Mussolini and Hitler's example. The younger forces of the party wore blue shirts and blouses. The worthy gentlemen wore standard pan-European ties. The stormtroopers of the new party greeted their leaders enthusiastically, but the fascist salute does not yet appear to have been adopted. Although at times Goldenherr Kalergi had adopted the entire stock of the Nazis' demands, and particularly the conservative and labor services, slave labor concepts of Hjalmar Schacht and the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and the British Crown decided in 1933 to follow Schacht's suggestion and give the Nazi movement preference over the pan-European movement. Goldenherr reported the content of his conversation with Hjalmar Schacht at the beginning of 1933. He says, Hjalmar Schacht was able to bring about the clever trick of remaining a follower of the pan-European movement in spite of his admiration for Hitler. In his moderate disposition, he explained to me, in 3 months Hitler will be Reich Chancellor. But don't get worried, Hitler is the only man who is in the position of being able to reconcile Germany with the Western powers. You will see Hitler will bring out Pan-Europa. Hitler alone can create Pan-Europa because he alone has no right-wing opposition to fear. Therefore, he and only he will succeed in finally securing Europe's peace and cooperation. 1971, in the conclusion of his book, Count Goldenherr set out his hope for a new leader. He says, the time is ripe for a new flood under new leaders in a new spirit with a view of the 21st century. And Otto von Hapsburg recently seized on this memorial passage when he prophesied. He says, the day can come that will demand decisions from us of great consequences in the convocation of all fellow citizens of European will. When this day comes, I will be ready as always. Now, if you look at people like E. Michael Jones, central figure now, obviously Opus Dei guy, Randy Angle, who runs aka Catholic.org, exposed this whole thing. E. Michael Jones funding and business partnership with the Opus Dei supernumerary, obviously expressing the Opus Dei view in everything that he does, and yet he'll deny it. And then this guy is propped up as the leader of conservative Catholic theology, even though if you listen to E. Michael Jones' theology, he never mentions Catholic theology. He brings up Jungian concepts like he's the Catholic Jordan Peterson, whatever his name is. But in E. Michael Jones' books, he praises Hjalmar Schacht. He says, oh yeah, Hjalmar Schacht's superinflation was so good for the German economy. And that is not how it works. Because the same bankers that set this thing up, set up the looting operations later on, through which, in the loans for Germany's wars, to which the Germans had to loot in order to pay off the debt. So E. Michael Jones doesn't know what he's talking about most of the time, and his history is generally just as bad as his theology to somehow fit that in by attacking capitalism and by praising Nazi economics. Going on, subheading, dictatorship, the form of the state. Quote, only a dictator would make possible the introduction of a new form of life, of a new tradition in Europe, for he will carry through the tradition with violence. All other attempts to do this will fail because then he would only find limited acceptance. Count Koldenhoff Kalergi could frequently give opinion about the form the state would take. Europe's population had not yet experienced the Second World War. But today, Otto von Habsburg expresses himself on this question in a somewhat different manner. The cover for his discussion in this fictitious case of terrorist blackmailing a state with nuclear weapons, the Pan-European Union proceeds from the false assumption that terrorists could manufacture nuclear weapons in their basements. It says, quote, what would happen would downright forces itself upon us. First of all, the concept of the state of emergency would have to be newly rewritten, and it must be that the invocation of the state of emergency leads to the automatic application of the special considerations. Quote, the essence would be all power without delay would be turned over to a single individual person for 9 months. For the period of this state of emergency, this man should have the right to suspend all the laws and to take all the measures that are necessary for maintaining the life of the population. This man would be chosen along with the application of the constitutional reform in secret joint session of federal parliament, the federal senate. He would automatically step into the chancellor's position in a state of emergency. The functions of the federal president would also have to set aside the period of the state of emergency. The country's chief justice would have to step up to the plate. And with all the involvement of the state of emergency, martial law would have to be imposed. It appears to be the absolute necessity for such a situation to have a system of justice that operates very quickly. For example, to reintroduce the personal problems of Otto von Habsburg when evaluating these extremely suspicious statements. A short time ago, he remarked that he had an erotic relation to discipline. A more in-depth psychological treatment of this question here, however, would carry us far afield. Next to the demand for a dictatorship, Hapsburg views hereditary monarchy as the best form of the state because the necessary objectivity of the head of state can only be supplied by professional education from the time a person first learns to walk. Habsburg has this form of state in mind for a united Europa. As chairman of the Council of the highest judges, the monarch would have the function of being the supreme judge of the Constitution and could therefore decide on the constitutionality of laws. Quote, certainly the duties of the head of state will go beyond the area of those who guard the law. He will have the control of the executive when this is naturally called upon to carry out the judicial powers. Nevertheless, the duties will only be secondary importance next to the primary duties of the monarch, who will, first of all, bind the monarchs of individual states. In his statements on written constitutions, Otto stands fidelity to the ideas of Count Koldenhoff Kalergi, who wrote, quote, the personality is the goal of the neo-aristocratic politic. The quality of human beings is the goal, not quantity. This does not involve the paragraphs of the Constitution, but it is concerned with having the best get ahead so that the best can rule. Hapsburg Networks, subheading. In addition to the fact that Hapsburg is the international president of the Pan-European member, a member of the Maltese Order, Knights of Malta, and of the Mont Pelerin Society, which plays an important role of political decision center for the inner circles of agents of Her Britannic Majesty, there is also another important fact about his life. After the Imperial Habsburg family was driven out of Austria in 1918, Empress Zita raised her oldest son Otto in such a way that any day he could assume the imperial crown. The restoration of the Habsburg monarchy was the goal which guided every action. Hitler, as well as Mussolini, had plans for Hapsburg. Mussolini was an enthusiastic ally of the family. I am absolutely for having Otto come to the throne in Austria as well as in Hungary. And when Habsburg met Prince August William von Hohenzollern, the son of the last German emperor in Berlin, in 1932, Prince August already was wearing an SA uniform, told Habsburg of Hitler's plan to set him up as a leader of the national opposition in Austria. However, Habsburg opted for exile in the U.S., where together with Koldenhoff Kalergi, he built up a network for a federate. So this is where the USA aspect of the Habsburg power and turn of taxes power comes from, at least the right wing. He built up a network for federated post-war Europe. He was calculated on better chances for an imperial empire on the level befitting a Habsburg. In 1943, his friend Winston Churchill promised him that when the Russians were maneuvered out of the middle of Europe, an Austrian, Hungarian, Bavarian federation would be the ideal solution. A year before, in the New York Council of Foreign Affairs Monthly Foreign Affairs magazine, They said on the matter in which he wanted the Americans to reconstruct Europe after the war, he says, quote, everything there will depend upon whether the Allies can decide this time to encourage the proper forces in Germany and in those areas occupied by Germany. The proper forces are those who are working towards federalism in Germany and who want to create a supranational community on the Danube. Despite his contacts to President Roosevelt and the massive influence of the pan European network in the USA, the Catholic community in pro Soviet circles around General Eisenhower were strong enough to prevent his restoration after the war. But Goldenberg and Hapsburg still had a British card in their hands to use against the alliance between Stalin and Eisenhower. After the war, the entire pan European initiative was controlled by the British and most of the time through Winston Churchill or by his stepson Dukin Sandys. The British Pan European Union Committee, that was founded in 1939 under the chairmanship of former colonial minister Ella Amory, formed the core of Her Majesty's agents, who would control the Pan European movement and the reconstruction of Europe after the war. This committee included the example Professor Gilbert Murray, who was one of the most important falsifiers of Greek history at Oxford University and who was specifically brought in for the re education of Germany. The same agents showed up once again in the Provisional Committee for a United Europe, founded in 1947, the time under the chairmanship of Winston Churchill. Duke and Sandys worked out its manifesto. In essence, the committee was not concerned with the generalities about the unification of Europe that were contained in the manifesto, but with the control of the continent. The executive committee of the organization consisted of 23 people, including Gilbert Murray and Lord Bertrand Russell, who was also one of the main players in the Congress for Cultural Freedom that we talked about, which also shared member with Mont Pelerin, Sir Karl Popper. Representatives of various parties in Britain, such as Oliver Stanley, colonial minister during the war, I.S. Amory, and Duke and Sandys. For the Conservatives, Labour Party members such as Victor Gollancz and Liberal Party members such as Sir W. Leighton. All churches were represented. The committee was supported by over 2,000 members, including the later Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, Lord Beveridge, and the banker Beddington Behrens, who reported that the movement for Europe, as it was called, was financed by Lord McGowan, the chairman of the Imperial Chemical Industries. Besides the continental European movements, the members of the committee also controlled the European Planning Board, an economic group in Paris that had a share in coordinating America's Marshall Plan aid, and in the National Committee of the European League for Economic Cooperation, also controlled by the British, was Ugo La Malfa, an experienced government destabilizer in Italy. Next, Count Goldner of Kalergi concentrated on establishing the European Parliamentary Union with Winston Churchill's support. It was founded in 1947 in Stade, Switzerland. Quote, it is the goal for our conspiracy to organize parliamentary majorities in the Europe will be strong enough for the force governments to carry out our program. Going on, in 1954, the first post-war Pan-European Congress took place in Baden-Baden. As President Count Goldenberg Kalergi sat next to Vice President Erich Mend and Paul von Zeeland. Today, President Pan-European Union Chairman in Germany and the former Minister for Exiles in Bonn, Joachim von Merkatz, was one of the most prominent speakers, as was Frankfurt School professor Max Horkheimer. Prince Lennart Bernadotte, an aspirant to the Swedish throne, reported about sociological experimentation on his island on Mainau in Lake Constance, which today is the Center for Environmentalists. Then, as a member of the Central Committee of the Pan-European Union, Otto von Hapsburg was confirmed in his role as Count Goldenberg Kalergi's chosen successor. So there is another Congress for Cultural Freedom and Frankfurt School connection with Horkheimer there. Subtitle, Habsburg's Power Base. The Pan-European Union Journal describes the post-war phases of organizational development briefly. Quote, the movement's fourth phase, 1947 to 1952, attempted to define a policy of European federalism for the governments by mobilizing the parliamentarians. Its instrument was The European Parliamentary Union, President George Bohoi, General Secretary Goldenherf Kalergi, which played a decisive role in founding of the European Council and the European Iron and Coal Union. Quote, the movement's fifth phase began after the death of Count Goldenherf Kalergi in 1973 when Dr. Otto von Hapsburg became the international president of the Pan-European Union. Although Count Goldenherf saw his task as building up the Pan-European Union as community for a few but influential personalities, Dr. Otto von Hapsburg considers it necessary to develop the Pan-European Union in all of Europe into a mass organization. In the meantime, there are national sectors in all EEC countries, in addition sectors in Greece, Spain, Switzerland, and Portugal. Interesting, those countries had a lot of problems in 2008. Eh? Under Habsburg's presidency, the European publication Pan Europa was once again set up as the Pan European Union's mass circulation organ, and the youth movement Pan Europa Youth was founded. Habsburg himself took care to cultivate international connections through the worldwide network of his family's dynasty and through his membership in the inner circles of the British oligarchy. So, for example, it was just a short time ago that Habsburg was, in his own words, in National Socialist China for 3 weeks as an ambassador of Europe. During this trip, he consolidated a geopolitically important front against the Soviet Union and confirmed the harmony of similar interests in face of similar dangers. Quote, and what was always said to me was that we should not, for God's sake, write off the German Eastern territories and all the Chinese questioning about German that is needed to bring forth a fourth major political party in West Germany. Already, the leaders of the associations of the exile leagues, the peasant associations, and the Pan European Union were very often the same people. In addition to the strong based separatist and anti communist mass base of these associations, Habsburg also gained the advantage of close organizational connections to the old Eastern Maltese and aristocratic networks. These people is Bavaria and the countries of the Alpine forest, South Tyrol, Austria, Vorarlberg, Trieste, and so forth. A great number of CSU members are also pan European members. Bavarian Christian socialist Heinrich Eigner plays a very important role as vice president of the Pan European Union, state chairman of the Pan European Union Parliament in Bonn, and member of the European Parliament. Count Hayes Hoon plays a similar role to Habsburg as the Circle's foreign policy expert on Africa as well as the Middle East. The Hans Seidel Foundation, the CSU's think tank, cultivates close relations to the Pan European Union. A branch office of the Hans Seidel Foundation in Cairo is thought to be the base through which the Habsburg influence can influence the Middle East. Not too long ago, Habsburg thought the opportunity favorable to present himself as an integration figure during a tour of the Chinese Democratic Union locales. Christian, I'm sorry, during a tour of the Christian Democratic Union locales. This is integration, I guess, East and West Germany. His sympathizers include leading CDU politicians Alfred Draeger, Karl Karstens, and Ernest Albrecht. Hans Egger John, a CDU vice president and its state chairman in Lower Saxony. Gerald Lowenthal and the many extreme right wing members of the Wittigo League can be counted as part of the circle of pan European followers, as can Prince von Lobkowitz, the president of the University of Munich and the chairman of the Bohemian Exile Association, former leader of Willy Brandt's SPD Ostborough in West Berlin, is now considered to be one of the most enthusiastic journalistic supporters of Pan Europa. Among other spirited followers of the Habsburg dynasty are the chairman of the South Tyrolean People's Party, Silvius, and the chairman of Trieste Autonomists, Enrico Pruner, to name only two from the Alpine Fortress region. In Italy, recently, the chairman of Pan European Union, Count Luigi Rossi de Montelera, and his friend Massimo di Carolis once again called for a new government crisis and defeat of the Christian Democratic politician Grinelli, whose policies are Montelera. He is a friend of Umberto Agnelli and Amintore Fanfani. He is also involved in the Spanish and Mexican networks that are grouped around the Pallavicini family of Italy's black nobility. Weeks ago in Paris, Hapsburg and Franz Joseph Strauss attempted to influence the government of French President Giscard d'Estaing towards Africa by holding a conference on the same topic with a number of French politicians. In the weeks and months ahead, Hapsburg will be attempting to strengthen the French flank of the operation, which got a good start when Alain Peyafite was named first General Secretary of the Pan-European Union. Hapsburg is in the habit of making policy for Africa through his family's bank and the Union Miniere implicated in the invasion of Zair's Shaba province. 1 and 2, Part 1 and 2 of Executive Intelligence Review on Hapsburg, an expose of who's behind the Pan-European Union. Now, this is very old. The LaRouche movement hasn't talked about this stuff forever, but it's extremely influential on all of these right wing and left wing, extreme left wing groups emerging in Europe that emerged after 2008 crisis and that are present in America and South America today. And my connection's becoming unstable. I'll probably finish The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elite, which I started and didn't finish. And there's some other things that I haven't finished. So I'll come back to that. But I'm going to put these videos in a playlist for things involving Mont Pelerin Society, Fabian Socialism, and all of that, because this is the real nexus, um, the locus of all of these things. It's all intersecting in the same location. And nobody else talks about these things. This is where the illusion of the left and right just fall.